This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache and you don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information. Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. Now, rates of voluntary attrition are at their lowest ebb in over a decade, certainly the lowest that I can remember. And employees at all stages of their career are loath to leave their roles, sort of worried about what is, I think, one of the most challenging job markets that many of us have seen, maybe most of us have seen, certainly since the financial crash. So despite all of that, though, it's not always the best decision that you can make to stay put. Companies, roles, individuals, teams, everything's evolving faster than ever before. And what might have started as a perfect fit might not fit anymore. But when do you know when it's time to leave? Is it too risky in this job market? Better to tough it out? How do you exit a business whilst keeping good relationships intact? Big, long list of questions. And to help us explore the topic and to dive into some of those, we've got a fantastic guest with us today. We've got Laura Kane, who is a career chief HR officer. Laura's got over 25 years worth of experience leading people functions and has seen all sides of this conversation. So I think we should just jump straight in. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Felix. It's great to be here. It's good to see you again.
So I wonder if we could just talk in with a bit of a broad question. How can you, you're a leader in an organization. How can you tell when it's time to leave?
Well, and I think that, you can think about that question a couple of ways. You can think about it for yourself, but I think as an HR professional, you need to be coaching your leaders on how to think about that really all the time, right? Whether that's for themselves, right? And or for people, in their teams, right? And that's not to suggest that you're always trying to tell people it's time to move on. I think that, the role you have with your company is a relationship, like any other relationship you might have in some other aspect of your life. And it's dynamic, right? You've got to continuously communicate, and that over time, things can change, right? And so the requirements of a role can change, right? The context of the business can change, right? That, when you think about things in a traditional talent review hierarchy, right? People can get to a point in their career for a variety of reasons where they may want to, continue to focus on one set of skills and activities, and they may be really good at those things, but that may no longer be what the organization needs, right? And so I think that if managers and leaders are having honest conversations with their employees, right? And if HR is continuing to have honest conversations with people about what the business needs and how that defines roles and how people fill roles, it's less of a problem when you start to say, hey, maybe there's something changing here. Maybe we need to think differently about, who we have in that seat.
It feels like a bit of a new way of approaching a career. I mean, certainly in my parents' generation, you join a business and that's the business that you're in. And that's a commitment made between employee and company and employee that there will be a role, and that whilst there's a role, they'll stay in the organization. But it feels to me like in our culture, that's shifted quite significantly, and that businesses are being more rigorous around reassessing people and seeing whether they're right for the role. And I certainly feel like team members are doing the same. Is this something that you see sort of a trend where it's continuing to be more and more rigorous, or do you think we sort of hit a nice little equilibrium now?
I do think we see more instances of people who are 2 to 3 years and then, may move on to another opportunity, right? I think you still see people who may be at organizations, for 5, 10 years or longer, right? I think from my seat as an HR professional, and when I talk to candidates at whatever level, I'm really interested in what motivated that progression or that change, right? That I think if people can articulate why they made a decision because of a progressive opportunity, particularly if they're in similar types of roles, right? I tend to be a bit more skeptical when I see that someone has consistently moved from the same role
Mm.
multiple times, as opposed to say someone who's done something, even if it was for, a more, you know, short duration, 2 years, but has moved on to then something, that had either progressive scope or additional complexity, or maybe something slightly different. But it's all in the telling of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That certainly makes sense from a candidate perspective. I wonder in your career whether you've seen themes of things that happen to organizations that make jobs, particularly senior jobs, shift in their expectations and in the sort of the nature of the role and who'd succeed in them.
Yes, and I think and I spent a long time in large institutional financial services organizations, and in very large organizations, if you have, say, a business reorganization, a large bank decides it's no longer going to have a credit card business. Well, that's going to
Yeah.
prompt, changes to some of the people who are doing those roles. There could be macroeconomic concerns, right? Say the 2008 financial crisis certainly created a lot of changes within banks around, say, whether that was good bank or bad bank, or some historical practices, around proprietary trading that changed. So that might mitigate, changes for roles. In smaller organizations, like the organization I was in most recently, I think, in instances of high growth, right, you will very quickly see roles, the requirements for roles change because of some of the changes that are associated with the growth in the business. Maybe you're shoring up infrastructure to support growth projections, but maybe there's also a change in how the company is generating revenue, right? That which could include the acquisition, of a similar business or a different business that creates kind of, a broader range for that company. And all of those things, I think, can then have implications for what are the requirements and whether or not, you have the right people in the role. I think, just as one example, right, if you think about a CFO, like the CFO in a private company that's in growth mode is a very different role than a CFO in a public company that's, both have to report out to, say, investors, right? But I think, kind of the inward focus of the private company CFO, very different than kind of saying, somebody who in a public company is kind of speaking to the market and trying to direct how the market will respond, to that company's value in the coming quarter or half.
Yeah, and I bet I would imagine, not that I've IPO'd myself, but I would imagine that there's another kind of CFO as well, which is taking one that's preparing a company for
Yeah.
IPO and then establishing themselves on the market. I would imagine there's a whole different skill set that goes along with that.
And I think even in instances, say, of private equity backed companies, right, say that people in leadership roles, under one structure could be different than the people in leadership roles, in the next structure, given what, whatever that, trajectory might be. Maybe there is a plan to take a company public, right? Or maybe there is a plan to change the structure of the businesses within that company, right? And, I think that's where it's good to have just honest conversations about what are the business needs right now? What does that mean in terms of the type of roles the organization needs? And then who are the people that we have to fill those roles, right, at this time, right? And, maybe there's opportunity to think differently about that. And on a more micro level, right, I think every year in performance management, that's what should be happening. I think my philosophy on any sort of HR activity, right, is that it has to be done like a business for a business. These things can't exist for their own sake, right? Sometimes I would make a joke with managers that say, if I gave you a choice, you could do a performance review or you could chew on glass. I'd say most people would choose the glass. Why? Because they've had these experiences where they have to do performance reviews just for their own sake and not, in the context of saying, this is really important because the process is actually, far less important than the output from that process, right? If we don't have an honest conversation about what's going well, what could go better, what could be done differently in a subsequent year, we're limiting the performance of the person in that role, but we're really compromising the effectiveness of the manager, right? Because the next role you're going to recruit for should be influenced by the perspective you had on how the individual performed well and how the team is performing. And if you don't capture that in some way that's useful to you on the forward, you're just going to be wasting time, later, that you could be using on something else, right? So I think that anytime I've approached, whether it's performance management or succession, right, underperformance, high performance, it all has to be contextualized, in the business context, right? That as an HR professional, you have to be innately curious about how the business works, how it makes money, what's going wrong when it's not making money, so that you can propose, interventions or HR processes or products that will align and support that.
Yeah, no, that really resonates. I wonder, when it comes to that conversation that you have with your heads of department, say, how do you have those conversations with them? How do you coach them to be analyzing whether they're the right person for the role? Or is it always the person at the level above analyzing whether they've got the right people in their team?
I mean, I think a manager has to own their team, right? And I think if you abdicate your authority and ability to do that, right, you've actually made yourself less relevant for your own role. So now I don't think you make those decisions in isolation, right? But, a manager, that's part of a manager's job at whatever level, to really be considering the effectiveness, the outputs, the performance, the engagement, the future projections, say, for people in their roles. In terms of how do you have that conversation, I think another thing that's important to remember as an HR professional is that, you're only as good as the last thing you did, right? And that's not as, fatalistic as it sounds. I mean, I think that, if you do something well, great, right? You'll want to continue to do something well. If you do something and it doesn't go well, look at it, figure out what you could have done differently, and move forward. And that's, I think, really important in kind of establishing, credible, trust-based relationships with your business clients, right? Don't rely on, kind of a historical good relationship, right? Or don't assume that, you can't turn something around. But if you're honest and candid, right, and you build rapport, right, and you address things in real time, right, you're going to be in a position to have that conversation with someone about whether or not, like, hey, I've heard you talk about this person, right, and how you have some concerns about their performance. Should we think about this a bit more broadly? Is it more than just a performance issue, right? And do we maybe need to think about something differently? And I think over time, right, you build that trust, you kind of help them with their own team. That puts you in a position to kind of have that conversation with them about their own role, right? And with yourself about your role, right? I think that, but it's all incremental, right? It's not going to go well if you walk in to lunch with someone you've known for 20 years to say, I don't want to spend time with you anymore. Wait, what? And it's kind of the same thing, right? I can't just walk in and say to you, I don't think you fit in this company anymore. Wait, what? That doesn't make sense. And of course, that's not going to go well.
I guess you've got to create a culture. I guess maybe the challenge is that you've got to create a culture of, I guess, continual evaluation of the way everything works in the organization, and a sort of clarity and alignment of where the business needs to go, and to have those two conversations very regularly. And I suppose if those are being had and everyone's being upfront and transparent around where they think the general new skills need to come from, where the new challenges are, then I'd imagine those conversations are much easier to have, because they don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in context.
Yeah. And like a lot of things, it's easier said than done, right? It's a bit like,
Yeah.
And oftentimes we think we're doing those things, but, maybe we could be doing them better, right? I think I said before that I think like a really good, HR person, has to be innately curious about how the business operates, right? And how the business makes money. I think, a really good HR person has to be, hyper enthusiastic about continuous improvement, right? Sometimes I say to my teams, right, we should never do the same thing the same way twice. Now, on surface level, that sounds crazy. Like, wait a minute, like, what are you saying? You create a new process every time? That's not what I'm saying, right? You have to have process. How you onboard people, how you do a search, right? How you do performance management. But every time you go through that process, you should be looking at it critically. Is there something we could do better or differently the next time we do this? And look for ways to kind of, make those changes incrementally. I mean, I think to your point, say if an organization is always doing those things, that will happen. I think the challenge is like, kind of creating a culture that does that. Everyone's busy, right? There's always more stuff to be done. And I think often in small organizations, where there are fewer hands than there is work, right? And things are changing rapidly. People are so often heads down just trying to get stuff done that it's very difficult then to focus on, pause, have those conversations. And that's where I think having process like year-end reviews or mid-year conversations is really important, right? But how they're done and kind of why they're done, not for their own sake, right? But for the sake of saying, how are we making this business better? How are we making ourselves better? Makes them useful.
Yeah, I can, that really rings true. I think there's one more sort of structure that I've heard of that I'd love to get your perspective on. Now, I'm doing a classic man thing here, not to gender stereotype too much, but I'm like pretty sure it's Reid Hoffman. I'm going to say it's Reid Hoffman, and I'm pretty sure the books is called The Alliance. If it's not, I'll edit this out, but I'm going to say it with confidence now. Right, so Reid Hoffman and the wrote a book called The Alliance, and one of the things that it says in there is that when you make a job offer, it's sort of one of the big lies of our world, where you're saying most companies say to an employee, we want to hire you forever, and the employee says, well, I want to join you forever, and that's it. And you might ask someone a question like, where do you want to be in 10 years? And they say, running one of your business lines. Of course, it's going to be, I really want to work in your business for 10 years. And everyone knows it's a bit of a lie, but we all go along with it. And I think his perspective was actually we should just break that down and just do what he calls tours of duty, which is you recognize as an employer that you're part of someone's career, and they recognize that they're part of your workforce for a specific for the phase of business that they're in right now. And essentially, instead of just committing to each other open-ended, you commit to each other for a tour of duty of 2 years. And you sit down and you agree mutually what you want to achieve in those 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, you sit down again and you say, do we want to recommit for another 2 years? And whilst I've never done that in an organization, I like it on a sort of an emotional level. I like the honesty around, I get that you'll change as an individual and you get that we'll change as a business, and that's fine. What do you make of that?
I think we really do need to be honest about that, right? And I think even that question of saying, where do you see yourself in 5 years, right? I mean, I think there's or 10 years, right? The extreme version of what you said. Oh, I see myself running one of your companies. The other extreme version is, I don't know, I'll see what happens. That's not a great answer either, right? But I think somewhere in the middle is, where do I see myself? I want to see myself, having progressed from this point, still being intellectually challenged, still feeling like there's growth ahead of me, still feeling like that I'm appropriately challenged, that I like the people that I'm working with because I feel like we're moving in the same direction. I understand how my work contributes to the organization. That's where I see myself in 5 years. But if in 5 years, that's not where I am, I need to be making a different decision. And, it's not an alarm clock. It's not in 5 years you're going to wake up and say, let me go through the checklist again, right? It's kind of this iterative process that's happening in real time. And I think, all the different buzzwords that kind of pop up in industry that make people then question whether or not the job they were hired to do is the job they're doing, or the job they thought they started at the beginning of the year is the job they're doing, the role of AI, macroeconomic concerns, political concerns, a whole myriad of things that are shifting, right? That will change some of that. Organizations have to adapt. People have to adapt, and sometimes that adaptation means, hey, is this still what I want to do, right? I think it's easier to quit and stay than it is to kind of make an active decision to leave. But people need to feel confident that they can bet on themselves and their abilities, even in a challenging market, right? That businesses are looking to buy a certain skill set. Individuals have skills and experiences that they're looking to sell. It's a
Mm.
transaction. And I don't mean to diminish the importance of the human in that, right? But I think part of what makes people reluctant to move on, is this fear of having to put themselves out in the process of looking for a new job, the fear of rejection or leaving something safe behind. And so I think it's helpful to people to think about that in a different way to kind of ensure that they're making the right decisions, whether they're looking for a job internally or externally, that may be different than what they have currently.
Such a good point. I think there are two parts to this. I think it is a bit of a scary job market at the moment.
Oh, sure.
I wonder, what would you say is the right way, both as an individual and for the company, to sort of preserve those relationships that you've got? What do you think is the best way to leave a job that you've decided isn't the right fit for you anymore? But let's assume that it's not because everyone's sort of being really unpleasant to you. It's you just feel like the role's changed or you've changed, or so we're not doing a I'm being harassed in the workplace kind of quitting, if you see what I mean.
That's a different HR hat. We can do another conversation about investigations, but we won't do that today. Again, I'm such a proponent of transparency and honesty, and I am the first person to. I may not be the first person, but I think I'd be among one of the first people to say I also understand that people are reluctant to feel that way in the workplace, right? The idea of telling your boss, "Gosh, I don't know if this is really the right role for me." Um, you know, and I think it's very difficult for people to be looking for a job and doing their current job well, right? But that's the reality. Most people, will not let their manager know they're thinking about something different until, they have a signed offer letter, an agreed start date, right? If they're in a regulated industry, they've cleared their background check, all of those things, right? Um, I've always been impressed with people who feel comfortable telling their manager early on, hey, I'm in a couple of conversations with X, Y, or Z about a particular role. I don't know where it's going to go, but I took the call because you know greater scope of opportunity or potential earning potential, whatever that might be, right? Um, that gives the manager, I think, some opportunity to kind of say, okay, what could we do differently, as opposed to that reactive kind of claw them back when it's too late.
And that's such a bad time. It's such a bad time to have that conversation when it is.
Oh yeah,
Even if you end up staying, I think there's a bitter taste in the mouth, and then you've screwed over the company you were going to join.
yeah, and there's lots of data I think on that too. I can't cite it off the top of my head, but I know I've seen this countless times, right? Say that, people who've given notification and then are clawed back, there's a huge percentage of them who leave then within the next year.
Oh, really? No, I'm not
Yeah,
surprised.
because whatever was the impetus for the dissatisfaction in the first place, you may have assuaged it in the short term with additional pay or a promise of other opportunities. If someone doesn't see that happening at the pace that they want, right, that they're going to move on. But my point around saying, it's highly unusual, say, for people to tell their manager, right, that they're looking for another job until it's much too late. Again, takes me back to the whole piece around, relationship, right, and that if the manager owns the team and kind of owns the conversations with them about what's going well, what could be going better, what do we want to do differently, they're going to build that kind of rapport that creates a space where people may feel safer doing that. Doesn't mean everyone's going to do it, right? But I've seen people be successful at that. Very senior leaders and more you know mid-level and early career managers, right? That taking the time to build rapport and trust with your team, and everyone thinks they're doing it, but unless you're kind of really taking the time, which nobody feels they have because they're trying to get other things done, it's going to cost you time on the other side when that person decides they want to move on. I don't know if that fully answers your question, right? But sometimes a lot of HR feels like, blinding glimpses of the obvious, right? And, that we could all be better at doing them, all be reminded of how we could do the better. Right? So there's a movie out it's from a million years ago, When Harry Met Sally, and they cut this line about everyone thinks they have good humor and good taste, but we could all get better at it. Everyone thinks they're a great manager. Everybody thinks they're a great communicator. Everybody thinks they build trust. Everybody thinks people like working for them. You got to test those assumptions, right? And you got to be comfortable with it when someone pushes back on that, right? And not avoid it, but kind of step into it, because that will pay off for you in the end. And that's whether you're an HR leader, business leader, or functional leader, whatever it is, right? And I think a good HR professional builds rapport with their client group and kind of encourages that, either through their own coaching of that person, right, or supporting them as they try to work through that with their team.
And I'd imagine the right kind of leadership and management style evolves as quickly as the role does as well. I would imagine that you need a slightly different management style if you're a publicly traded leader of a publicly traded company that's, you got 25 people reporting into you, than if you're in a plucky startup with 3. I mean, patently, right? That's so it's something that's evolving as quickly as the business.
True, although I would argue that from a span of control, no one can effectively manage 25 people. But again, that can be a different conversation. But yeah, I think the requirements, will change, right? But the fundamentals, right? Honest communication, right? Kind of, active listening, taking, a real interest in your people, admitting what you don't know, and I think I admire. I think that the hard thing, the more senior you get, is that having to have oversight for people or functions that maybe you yourself didn't run at one point. And that becomes even more complicated in a changing business, because maybe there's a new function in a group, like I think, like things like cybersecurity or information security, things that just didn't have the same meaning 5 years ago, it didn't even exist, say like 10 years ago. And if you're the chief technology officer and you have to have oversight for that, you have to hire people who are doing things that you never did, right? It didn't even exist, previously. But again,
I mean, AI departments will be next.
Let's say exactly, right? But that goes back to the fundamentals, right? That if as a leader you're okay asking questions and trusting people who are working with you to help you understand things, giving them room to grow, right? That's engaging and retaining for them. But that also allows you to build rapport and allows you to have some understanding of what's happening, and makes it less likely that you're going to try to micromanage everything, which has its own issues as well.
Absolutely. Well, we are sadly out of time, but I think this has been really valuable, Laura. So thank you so much for talking it through. I think both from the position of an HR leader, making sure that everyone in a senior or everyone in a role in the organization is the right person, but also for that point that we spoke about right at the beginning. I just do think that a lot of people are staying in jobs at the moment that just aren't right for them, and they're a little bit miserable. And hopefully this will be a bit of a call to action that, you don't have to jump ship entirely to have that open conversation. So it doesn't need to be an all or nothing, but have that transparency, speak to your manager, speak to your leadership team, and then, for God's sake, don't stay in a job that makes you miserable.
And bet on yourself. Right? I think that if you're a good performer and, you contribute to the team and, you're positive and you're engaged, and you're raising your hand, you're not, shrinking from ambiguity, there's always going to be opportunity for you. Right? And if that opportunity is in a context that's different than the one you're in currently, bet on yourself. That you're going to be able to present, that set of skills and experiences to find something that would allow you to continue to be challenged and engaged, right? Again, I think the idea of quitting and staying is terrible for companies, but it's really terrible for people as well. Even worse.
How's that for a call to action? Bet on yourself. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today.
So great seeing you, and we'll catch up the next time you're stateside.